to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jacquie Luqman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And today we're talking about the role of Cuba in fighting the coronavirus. And we're happy to be joined for this conversation by Dr. Helen Yaffe, a lecturer in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow and author of the new book, Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World. Dr. Yaffe, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. And Dr. Yaffe, you recently published an article called Cuba's Contribution to Combating COVID-19. And I think this is an important point because, rightfully so, there's a lot being published right now about the coronavirus, how quickly it's spreading in the United States. I always point out to people that, according to the World Health Organization, its spread has increased 13-fold outside of China, while China seems to have its numbers pretty well in hand. But that same Western press, and also the government, I should say, has been pretty silent, curiously so, about Cuban Interferon, that antiviral medication, and how it's being used, to combat and treat COVID-19. Like I say, it's been used in China, Cuba, Venezuela, and now reportedly Chinese and Cuban doctors are in Italy, a country that is in complete lockdown because of coronavirus for that very reason. Now, before we get into the broader politics of it all, I was hoping you could give us a little history on, interferon and maybe sort of Cuba's biotechnology history in general, and how that connects to how Cuban interferon is being used in regards to COVID-19.
Okay, so interferons are actually signaling proteins that are produced and released by host cells in the body, and they are produced and released in response to pathogens, so viruses, bacteria, parasites, tumor cells, and so on. And their function is to alert other cells close to them to heighten their defenses. So interferon itself is something that is natural in the body. The problem is that when viruses attack, they also reduce the capacity of the body to produce interferons. So they were discovered, the actual existence of interferons was discovered back in 1957 by some people who were doing some work in London on viral interference. And then other scientists took this up, a US scientist working in the 1960s as a researcher in Paris. And then in the 1970s, you had this US oncologist, so that's a medical specialist dealing with cancer. His name was Randolph Clark Lee. He was taking up this research and just catching on to the tail end of during the US presidency of Jimmy Carter of improved relations with Cuba. He joined a medical delegation to visit the island of Cuba and look at the health facilities. And during that trip, he had a conversation with Fidel Castro, and Fidel Castro was apparently penetrating questions about medical promises, potential for the future, particularly on cancers. And at this point, Dr. Clark convinced Fidel that interferon was going to be the wonder drug. And he offered to take one Cuban medical scientist in his laboratory. Fidel Castro persuaded him to take two. And they went over there and they started to collect information. They were also put in touch with a man called Kari Cantel, who was a Finnish in the he'd isolated interferon from human cells. This man was committed to global health, so he had refused to patent his process, which meant that it was open for others to use. And in 1981, 6 Cubans went to spend 12 days in Finland with Cantel, learning how to produce large quantities of this interferon, which helps the body, as we said, to fight viruses, etc., and other pathogens. So this is the interesting thing. These were young scientists who were trained entirely under the revolutionary regime. Now, they returned and they were put into an old former mansion of one of the elite who'd left Cuba. It was known as House 149, and they converted it into an interferon laboratory. Later on, it went on to become the Center for Biological Studies. Fidel Castro visited them, encouraged their work. And within just 45 days, the Cubans had managed to produce their own interferon. And they tested it on themselves. They sent it off to be tested in Carrie Cantel's laboratory. He confirmed the quality. And just days after that process had finished, Cuba had this very virulent and unusual outbreak of dengue fever. And to cut the long story short, basically the decision was taken by the Ministry of Public Health in Cuba to use this interferon to fight the dengue fever. Now, the interesting thing about the dengue fever was it was a particularly virulent strand of dengue, which can trigger life-threatening fever, and it had never appeared in the Americas before, but it was, rapidly sweeping through the population. It was an epidemic. It affected 340,000 Cubans, 11,000 cases, new cases were being diagnosed every day at its peak. So these are the sorts of numbers we're going to be getting used to here. And death toll was 180, including 101 children. But the Cubans used their interferon to combat the dengue fever, and it had a very quick and very dramatic effect on cases, particularly in children, and slowing the epidemic. So they carried on doing their work with interferon, and it was in, I believe, 1986 that the Center for Genetic Engineering Biotechnology developed the Interferon Alpha 2B, a recombinant medicine drug that they are using now, which has been selected as, we have to say, one of 30 different antiviral drugs to combat the outbreak of COVID-19 in China.
Right. And I appreciate you laying out a lot of that history and a lot of that science, Dr. Yaffe. And, getting into, I think, the more political aspects of it, obviously, Cuba, a country that has been under blockade for the better part of a century at this point, has still been able to make these advancements. And, we've been seeing, I believe Cuba's been in partnership with China to this end for a little while now, since at least the early 2000s. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Cuba has been doing a lot of this work with other countries that basically find themselves within the crosshairs of the U.S. government. And it's my feeling, and you can tell me if you disagree, that really puts the American people at a disadvantage at a time like this. Because what that means is, I think, is that, we won't have access to this this proven effective treatment, basically because of Washington's determination to basically, roll back the gains of Cuba's revolution.
Well, it's interesting. In response to the article which I wrote, which you referred to, some people have contacted me to attempt to clarify that the interferon alpha 2B is produced by other companies in other countries. And the main concern is this question: will citizens in the US be able to get hold of this antiviral drug? But that may be the case with interferon alpha 2B, but there are also many other innovative science breakthroughs that the Cubans have, both on record and up their sleeves, in the pipeline, the term is. For example, Cuba has Sinovac EGF, which is a lung cancer vaccine. Now, during the brief rapprochement between the United States and Cuba under the end of the second term of Obama, a license was signed for a cancer research center in Buffalo, New York, to trial this lung cancer vaccine. And that trial has managed to stay on track when the Trump administration has interrupted basically all the other forms of communication that were happening in between the countries. And that's very promising. But, at any point, we don't know what will happen to that trial. But it's just one example of the extent to which US people in the US themselves, and in fact all around the world, are losing out on the incredible investments made by the Cubans in the context of a centrally planned socialist system which has prioritized public education, public health, and where all biotechnology institutions are in state hands. They are not profit-driven. They're not motivated by financial speculation. They are integrated into the public health needs of the population, both in Cuba and actually essentially abroad.
And, Dr. Yaffe, I'm so glad that you mentioned the central government prioritizing the health of the people of Cuba and other countries over profit, because obviously that's not something that's happening in the United States. But it would seem that this would be a time for this country and nations across the globe to come together and to work on producing and coordinating the distribution of these needed medicines alongside Cuba and China, especially here. But that's not happening in particular with the United States, even though the Cuban pharmaceutical industry has stated they have enough inventory on hand to ensure domestic public health and distribute the interferon to more harshly affected countries abroad. But the United States government, under this president in particular, is actually trying to gain exclusive rights to a treatment from a German firm. So how does the United States, how do United States citizens respond to the existence of a treatment for a disease or a virus that we are being exposed to, that other countries around the world are being given freely, but we have a government that basically is trying to profit off of a treatment from another country and doesn't want to do business at all, doesn't want to reach out to Cuba to save the lives of its own citizens?
Well, I mean, that can hardly surprise us, right? Because after Hurricane Katrina, I'm sure that you know that hundreds of Cuban medics went and sat with their bags packed and their emergency equipment ready to go over to New Orleans and the other affected areas and to give emergency, urgent medical aid in conditions that they're accustomed to, in conditions where there's no built hospital infrastructure, where there's not necessarily electricity, so they have to do in the field diagnostics and so on. And in that period, under the presidency of George Bush, their offer to, save lives essentially in the United States, mainly the lives of poor people and black people, was completely censored and ignored. In fact, when the United States published a list of countries that had offered to help or had donated, Cuba wasn't even on that list. So, I mean, it's quite clear that there's no interest in public well-being in human beings. This is a system, the biotechnology system sector internationally is incredibly parasitical. It's incredibly speculative. You have thousands of small biotech companies and big biotech companies and big pharma biotech companies which produce absolutely nothing. And yes, it is still a multi-billion-dollar industry because it's all about selling on the stock markets, IPOs and so on, and massive bubbles of speculation, but very few drugs entering the market and very few drugs priced at levels that they are accessible to the public that needs them.
Yeah, and another thread that I think is running through this, Dr. Yaffe, when we think about both Cuba's contributions to COVID-19 treatment and perhaps its medical development endeavors generally since its revolution, is this thread of national cooperation which I think has been shown from that period up until this very day. And I think it is also something that I think the United States government could definitely take a lesson from, as we're simply not seeing that today. And so from your perspective as a historian of this, how central has that kind of, we could call it state-to-state communication and partnership, how important has that been both to the development of, interferon and perhaps, Cuba's medical endeavors in general?
Well, I mean, in terms of interferon, the sort of historical narrative that I gave shows that clearly, this developed out of a multinational cooperation where different scientists were sharing their research, and the Cubans were able to tap into that. And their first conference that they held, because their use of interferon for the dengue outbreak in 1981 became the biggest use in public health system of interferon at that point. And so they became sort of regarded as the experts, and they had a huge conference and they invited all of these international specialists. And actually, when I was studying the development of Cuban medical science and biotechnology for my book, it became very clear that while different US governments have used different levels of hostility or attempts to isolate Cuba, at the level of medical science, there has always been collaboration and communication between the US and Cuba and globally. But I mean, Cuba's collaboration with the rest of the world has been key, and it has been motivated by public health interests, although subsequently with the ability to export some of its biotech products, that's also become very important for the Cuban economy. This sort of export of biotech products began with another incredible story of Cuban medical science, which was the Cuban breakthrough of discovering a meningitis B vaccine, which happened in the second half of the 1980s. So Cuba had a terrible outbreak of meningitis, and at that time there was no vaccine for meningitis B, and it became the main health problem in Cuba. And again, children were particularly vulnerable, as they are to meningitis. And the Cubans created a team of multi-experts led by a wonderful woman called Concepcion Campa. And they worked intensively for 8 years. And finally, they produced a vaccine which has been used in Cuba, which received the UN medal, gold medal is called, in recognition of its importance and its contribution. And yes, a few years ago in Britain and some other countries in Europe, when a meningitis B vaccine was finally introduced, some 30 years after that date in Cuba, it was finally introduced just for babies under the age of 1, we were told this was the first time ever that meningitis B vaccine had been introduced to a public health system. So not only was that another important in terms of global health breakthrough that Cuban medical scientists had made, it was also completely censored in outside of Cuba and in the Western press and media. So this has been another feature which I hope that the chapter I've written on the curious case of Cuba's biotech revolution can fill some of those gaps in and tell a bit of that story that has so far been censored.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Helen Yaffe. We're going to leave it there. We definitely encourage folks to check out her new book, We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World. We're going to move to a break here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C., but we will be back. So please stay with us.
By any means necessary.